Erev Tov. Welcome back to our second part of Rav Mazuz, his introduction to his own book on stories and biographies of our tzaddikim. Last week, he walked us through a really interesting introduction where he picked on a genre that I labeled Hasidic tales. And his question was, where did this style come from? What are they hoping it will contribute? And why is it that even though you find all these stories were told in the Sephardic worlds, we don't have such a genre? So that was last week. This week, I want to walk you through. We left off with two questions, which was, well, why not? Why does this genre not exist? But we jumped the gun a little. So I want to take you back for a minute and talk to you about an interesting inverse relationship between the stories that are told and the ability of the people that it's told about. And he has some sharp criticism. Now, if you'll remember, he put a little footnote. He said, don't, God forbid, think I'm from the category of people who don't believe in any stories. He said, there are stories in the Gemara, there are stories of holy tzaddikim, there are stories, and he talks about the Baba Sali. He says, don't think I don't believe that stories are important. Simply the historicity, the truth, the authenticity, that's really what's important. So I want to now read with you. For those of you who have the PDF, we're going to be on page Chet. I don't know which page it is in yours. We're going to be in the second paragraph that starts Umikol Makom.
Somebody on Zoom will find the page this does.
If you find it on Zoom, please let us know what page you're on. Rabbi Meir Mazuz says, Umikol Makom, הסיפורים על חכמי ג'רבה ותוניס מעטים מאוד. We're on page 8. It says this, אנו רואים למשל, שהגאון בעל ערך השולחן, שהיה ראש אב בית דין בתוניס כ-20 שנה, וחיבר ספרים רבים ונכבדים, אשר תהילתם מלאה הארץ, כגון ערך השולחן, 5 כרכים, ובבי העמודים, על ספר יראים, חוקת הפסח, על הלכות פסח, ויזרע יצחק על התורה, ספר הזיכרון, ועוד לא בכתובים, מעטים מאוד הסיפורים ששמענו עליו. ורובם רק על גודל שקידתו בתורה ומידות הנעלות. He says, you should know there were many righteous scholars, both in Jerba and Tunis. So much so, but we don't hear stories about them. For example, he says, take the Erech HaShulchan, not to be confused with the Aruch HaShulchan, who wrote the following book, and he lists. Now you have to understand, we're going to, Bezrat Hashem, get to this Chacham. He says the Baal Erech HaShulchan authored dozens and dozens of books. I want to show you, this is just the beginning of the Erech HaShulchan, the set that you have. Right? He says he was the Av Bet Din for 20 years in his community. To be the Av Bet Din in a city where nobody knows anything is very easy. We're talking about a city where there were tremendous Talmidei Ḥachamim. The fact that he was the Dayan of the city for 20 years tells you that he was somebody extremely significant. And yet, what do we know about him? His books. We know about his books. We know about his diligence of learning Torah. We know about his good midot, and that's it. We don't have stories about the miracles and the wonders and him flying on magic carpets, nothing. In fact, מעטים מאוד, ורובם רק על גודל שקידתו בתורה ומידותיו הנעלות, skip the parentheses, ולא סיפורי נפלאות. He said, we don't know any wondrous stories about him. ואילו הרב חי טייב, and he puts in parentheses, maybe בן דודו, שלא כיהן ברבנות, וכנראה התפרנס מדיבים שהכירו והוקירו את ערכו. He says, compare it to another scholar who, he didn't have a position as a dayan. And it seems like he made his money from going around to the wealthy people who knew him and held of him in some value. ולא השאיר אחריו ספרים הרבה, and he didn't leave many books. So we're not talking about somebody as scholarly. What do we have? Oh, here you have a typo in this one. ולא, Rabu Ma'asav Niflotav. You find something interesting. So the author of the Erech HaShulchan, who authored dozens of books, sat as a dayan for 20 years. We don't have miracle stories. Yep. Reb Chai Taib, not a dayan. Seemingly also not somebody who is necessarily a scholar amongst scholars, but more amongst the wealthy people. What do we have about him? Bunch of wonderful miracle stories. He says you find something similar. V'chen etzel hagaon Rabbi Yeshua Basis, who he actually has a chapter later on. Rabbi Mazuz has an entire chapter on him. Shaya Talmido shel Harav Erech HaShulchan, who's the student of the Erech HaShulchan. Skip the parentheses. He says, I quote him in my book over there. He says about him, Alav, skip all the way down to the end of the parentheses. Alav yisaperu niflaot rabot v'norot. About him, they say, so the student, they have a bunch of miracles, wondrous stories about him. She'en dugmatan b'kol sipurei hamoftim b'shum eda b'Yisrael. The stories are so wondrous that even if you look into the Hasidic stories in any other genre, it pales in comparison to the stories they have about Rabbi Yeshua Basis. L'umat zeh, but opposite this, contrary to that, Al Harav Rabbi Avraham Cohen Yitzchaki, Talmido shel Rabbi Yeshua Basis. So the student of Rabbi Yeshua Basis, Rabbi Avraham, he was a mechaber hasvarim. Which svarim? Mishmerot Keuna, Shulchano shel Avraham, Mitzvot Keuna, Kafa Cohen, Enea Cohen, Chazdei Keuna, v'od, v'od, v'od. We're talking about, again, a prolific author. Nimsuru alav sipurim ma'atim belvad. We find very little stories told about him. V'gam hem enel sipurim niflaim. And even the stories that are told are not wondrous stories. Harav, and this is an important point. Harav Achida, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, Mevi, in his book, B'Ma'agal Tov, Al HaChacham Rabbi Avraham, he has a story about Rabbi Avraham Achi HaGvir, quote, Shemachzik atzmo efshar. He thinks he's a somebody. There's this Rabbi Avraham who thinks he's a somebody. Biyun shelo kadmo adam, ונוסף על זה אמר שהוא נביא, והוא ניצוץ ירמיהו ויחזקאל, והוא אומר סודות, וכל זה מרמוד רוחה דתבה, עד שנעשה שוטה. He says, the Kehillat records that he met in his travels. The Kehillat traveled extensively. So he was before Britannica and encyclopedias and Wikipedia. We had the Kehillat. He's documenting that he meets this person named Rabbi Avraham, the brother of a wealthy man who he thinks he's a real somebody. So much so that he tells you he's on par with Yecheskel HaNavi, Yirmiyahu. He knows the secrets of the Torah, and he knows the iyun, the deep, deep secrets of the Torah, so much so that when you listen to what he says, he makes a fool out of himself because he says such grandiose things. נעשה שוטה והוא מבזה כל חכמי ישראל. ובעונות שהוא תלמיד חכם, ויש לו שכל שלפעמים אומר דברים נחמדים. He says, maybe he sometimes here and there says nice things, but the exaggeration of he's like Yirmiyahu, like he's Yecheskel, that he talks to the divine, it makes him look like a fool. על רבי אברהם זה לא נשתמר לדורות דבר ולא חצי דבר. You want to know anything about him? The answer is there's nothing to know, because it was all hot air. And Rabbi Mazuz shows you something very interesting. You know, I always tell my husband, those who can sing are singers. And those who can't, they're cantors. You find the same thing over here. Those who are really Talmidei Ḥachamim, we have all their books. You see? The Erech HaShulchan, we don't need marvelous stories made up about him because he has so much literature that he left for Am Yisrael that those books tell us the glory of who he was. Unfortunately, the Rabbi Avraham who thinks he's a somebody but had nothing to show for himself is telling us that he's like Yirmiyahu HaNavi. Like he's Yecheskel. And you find this in human nature in general. We call it hot air. You ever see people who really are smart versus people who think they're smart? A person who's really smart, I'm going to use can I use my father-in-law? Yeah? He's not going to appreciate it, but I'm going to appreciate it. The first time we went to buy a car, don't worry, it was a second-hand car in our 15-passenger van. So we asked my father-in-law to come along to be able to make the purchase with us. So he gets into the van, and I'm thinking, why is he drive? No, my father-in-law opens the glove compartment. He takes out the manual. He's reading. He's looking. He's touching all the buttons. I'm thinking to myself, it's not the first time you're in a car. And my father-in-law said, yeah, but it's the first time I'm in this type of car, and I want to make sure that I'm driving it right. And I told my husband, that's a sign of greatness. Why? because I know people who are related to me, not from that side, who to show off how smart they are and how great they are and how wonderful, we once took one of those people, don't say. We once took them on a boat right here in Mission Bay. And the whole time they insisted they don't need any instructions of how to drive. A little boat. You know what happened to us within 5 seconds of getting onto that boat? We crashed. Why did we crash? Because when you have a little sechel, you have to show everyone you have a lot. But when you have a lot of sechel, the smart person is not afraid to say, I don't know. You find over here, Rabbi Mazuz is teaching you a principle. The very, very intelligent Talmid Chacham, his book spoke for himself. They didn't have to make up stories about him. And contrary, those who we have stories, it's almost always an indicator there was nothing more to the person. I know that if I spoke of my father-in-law, my mother-in-law's father, am I right? He would always say when he wanted to tell you a person was not so intelligent, I think it's from this week's parsha. What does it say? So you're going to say the pasuk. When the brothers sell Yosef HaTzadik, before they sell him, what do? Very good. They throw him into a pit. Alchanan, what does it mean, v'haborek en bo mayim?
And the pit is empty, there's no water inside of it.
Yes. So it says, and the pit was empty. They threw him into a dry well. But if you look into Rashi says, Aval nechashim v'akravim yesh bo. It's true, maybe there was no water, but there were snakes and scorpions. So my father would always say, yeah, when the well is empty, then there's always snakes and scorpions in there. When you find all this magic in the storytelling, it's already an indicator to you. Really, this is about borek.
He never called anybody stupid. He just would say about that person, haborek.
The well is empty.
The well is empty.
Yeah. So yesh lasim. It says yesh lasim lev me'hamur. He's going to call out a critique on researchers. Yesh lasim lev me'hamur. So you should be wary of those who say, שלא כדעת חוקרים מסוימים הכותבים, שהעם איתר את שם הרבנים החביבים עליו בסיפורי אגדות. You should know that it's really the stories that you hear, it's because the nation loved their leadership so much that they crowned them and they made stories about them. And he says, that's not accurate, that claim. Why? אם במשך כ300 שנה קמו בתוניסיה מאות רבנים, גאונים, דיינים ומקובלים. In a span of 300 years, the amount of scholars, dayanim, rabbanim, geniuses, Kabbalists that came from Tunis, ואשר להם יד ושם בחוגי הממשלה כידוע, they weren't just known in the Jewish community as scholars, also in the non-Jewish community and government. ומכולם לא נשמע מופתים רק על חד ותרי בדרה. And we didn't hear miracle stories, only one or two. סימן שהמופתים האלה, ולפחות רובם ככולם אמת המה. The ones that there were stories told about them, it was accurate. Because look, out of so many, in a span of 300 years, we have select stories. Why? Because those select stories were true. It wasn't that we took all the rabbis and posthumously, we started making up a whole bunch of stories. Because if that's the case, in a span of 300 years, look, Hasidut's only around 200 something years. You know how many stories we've had and they keep growing? That's not the case. He said the few stories that you find with miracles, it's because those were true. This we read last week, I'm rereading. The story about Rabbi Chalfon's grandson coming to ask the questions that today we're going to address, which is why don't we find this genre? Why don't we have these stories by the Sephardim? So I'm going to read it again because the story is worth it. סיפר לי הצדיק המנוח, רבי מיכאל כלפון עידן זצ"ל. שפעם שאלו אותו נכדיו ייבדל לחיים ארוכים. Once his grandchildren came and asked, מדוע רק לאשכנזים יש אדמו"רים ולנו אין? Why is it that by the Ashkenazim they have so many rabbis and we have none? And Rabbi Michael Kalfon answers, he says, כי אף פעם לא שמענו עליהם כלום. He said, because you never heard about them. It's not that we didn't have giants. Simply, we didn't write stories. ואכן שתי סיבות לדבר. And this is what I want to address today. Why? It cannot be that in the world of the Sephardim, there weren't giants. The fact that we have so many books tells us that, of course, they existed. So why don't we have stories about them? And Rabbi Mazuz is now going to share with him his two thoughts of why. Why doesn't this exist by us? He says, number one, ענוותם המיוחדת של חכמי הספרדים. Afterwards, yeah. afterwards. He says, you want to know why this genre doesn't exist? Why we don't hear the same stories that you hear about the Kutzker Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon and the Panovitcher of. He says, one is anava. גם בשעה שכיסה שמיים הודם ותהילתם מלא הארץ, הם הצניעו את מעשיהם בפשטות גמורה. Even, beautiful sentence, in the hour when the sky was covered with their glory and the world was filled with their praise, הם הצניעו את מעשיהם. They were modest about their actions with complete humility. וטאטאו אותם מתחת לשטיח, and they hid them under the carpets. There's a story to illustrate. מסופר על הגאון ממונקאץ', בעל מנחת אלעזר זצ"ל. So the mincha, we mentioned him last week. No,
It's not him.
it's not him, but it's that same. Yeah, nachon. No, this is the one who called the Sephardim Makat Tzevardea. He went on a tour. ששמע את שמוע של הסבא קדיש הגאון רבי שלמה אליעזר אלפנדרי או אלפנדרי זצ"ל, שהיה מתקיפי קמא, גדול בנגלה ובנסתר, ובעל זיכרון עצום מיוחס לשבט יהודה, והאריך ימים קרוב ל-118 שנה. ועד יומו האחרון לא עזבו שכלו וצלילותו דעתו להפליאה. So the Munkach Rebbe went on a tour to Israel. And he heard about this incredible person. Who did he hear about? He heard about Rabbi Shlomo Eliezer Alpandri. Yafin. This is a picture of him. Not the Minchas Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer. Yeah, this is, in fact, there's a street in Yerushalayim named after him. How do I know? Because just yesterday I was talking to my mother, and she said, oh, the event she went to was on Rehov Alpandri. I said, I don't even think you know what the name is. So what happens? The Minchas Elazar from Munkach, Hungary, he hears that in Israel there's a tzaddik. He's lived till the age of 118. His mind is completely clear. His thinking, he has no dementia. His thought process, he knows Torah, Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara, Halacha, Kabbalah. This is somebody who knows all of Torah Kula. And until the last day, his sharpness never left him. ישנן תשובות ארוכות שכתב אותן בגיל מעלה מק"י שנה, כאיש אשר כוחו במתנה. In fact, we have his manuscripts, his writings, that he already wrote when he was 110, and his writing is as sharp and as clear as any other day. לשמע שמוע של האדם הגדול בענקים הזה, התעורר הגאון בעל מנחת אלעזר, ובא ממונקאץ' הרחוקה עד לירושלים תיבנה ותקנה, להיפגש פנים בפנים עם הסבא קדישא. He heard about this person living in Yerushalayim, and he said, I have to travel and go see it. Now you have to know a little bit of Hasidic history. The reason he went to see this person is in Hasidic literature, they believe that the following. Yeah. This is the Minchas Elazar. This is a picture of the Minchas Elazar. For those of you who Google him, you will see something very interesting. It is one of the few videos that you have before World War II. The Minchas Elazar is coming back from a wedding. I don't remember whose wedding. And he's in this, it's in a coach, right? And he's screaming about Shabbos. Mazal hit in the Shabbos, Mazal hit in the Shabbos. He's begging the people to keep Shabbat. Please keep Shabbat, and Shabbat will protect you. Unfortunately, this is right before the Holocaust, where much of Jewry is wiped out, though Hungary gets hit less. But here you find that the Minchas Elazar is traveling from Hungary all the way to Yerushalayim to meet this Rabbi Shlomo Eliezer. ומשאלה אחת בפיו, he comes to him, he meets him, and he says, היות כי שמעתי מרבותיי הצדיקים. He said, I have a tradition from my rabbis, my Hasidic leaders, כי בכוחו של צדיק הדור, לגזור שיבוא משיח מיד. That the person who's the most righteous in this generation, if you go to him and he says, Gzeira, I say that Hashem, you must bring Mashiach, Mashiach is going to come immediately. V'yigzor omer v'yakum lo. He says, Tzadik gozer v'akadosh baruch hu mekayem. This is something that's very deeply rooted in Hasidic literature, that the Tzadik has very special superpowers. And if you're going to go to the Tzadik of the generation, I'm being specific and telling you this is Hasidic teachings. Yeah. If you go to the Tzadik of the generation and you say, you have to declare Mashiach is coming, then Hashem has to listen. לכן, באתי לחלות פניך שתגזור שיבוא משיח. וצדיק גוזר והקדוש ברוך הוא מקיים. So he tells Harav Elfandri, that's why I came all the way from Hungary to you, so that you should declare that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to bring Mashiach, and then Mashiach's going to come. What do you think Harav Elfandri answers him? Yeah, today, if the story was written today, he would say, please, if you leave a $15,000 donation and you make monthly payments, I can get you to do anything. לשמוע בקשה זאת, עונה הסבא קדישה בפשטות גמורה. Rabbi Shlomo Eliezer Alfandri answers him. He hears this question, and in his simplicity, what does he say? Ani? Eneni tzaddik ador. Me? I am not the tzaddik of the generation. V'lo yasaf. And he didn't add. That's it. The story ends here. מעתה עצה וחשוב אם בגדלותם הדבר כן, קל וחומר בילדותם. So you have to understand. Here, the greatest tzaddik of the generation is being approached, at least according to the Minchat Elazar, right? It's not like he got onto an airplane from here. We're talking about miles and miles and trekking of journeys because he felt that this was the leader of the generation. And what does the Sephardic Chacham tell him? I'm not the tzaddik ador. I'm not Moshe Rabbeinu. And just like that, the story is over. כמעט אין לנו סיפור אחד על הברקה או חידוש שאמר אחד מחכמי הספרדים בילדותו. It's interesting. You can imagine if he was so great when he's old, it's interesting to know what was he like when he was young. And yet you don't find either this genre of stories of, wow, when he was little, he knew the whole Shas by heart. When he was little, today they throw this name around a lot. Yenuka. You've heard the word Yenuka? I'm not talking about the Yenuka of today and all the controversy. I'm simply talking about it's a term that's used. No. So, Liyonek means to nurse, but the Yenuka is a term in Kabbalah where somebody comes down once in who knows how many years, this soul that, even from the moment it's born, it's already the greatest of the generation. Now, you should know this term. Imagine if you called everybody a genius. What would it do to the real title, genius? Nothing. It's inflation. Then it means nothing, right? If suddenly I tell everybody's the best, they do this, by the way, on state exams. Instead of saying, hey, we're making kids stupid, we have to reevaluate how we're teaching kids, they just keep lowering the bar. So now you could get a 5 on your quiz and you also pass. So what does it do? It doesn't tell you anymore you're smart. It just tells you that everybody's stupid equally. When terms lose their meaning, it doesn't mean anything anymore. So you have a whole genre of stories where from the baby was little, and I think Rabbi talked about this a little bit. We're going to talk about it much more next time. This whole subgenre of the child is not even born yet, and already he's the leader of the generation. The child is 6 months old, and instead of telling you normal stories about them, Hinuhol Mishnayot, Gemara, Chasidut, Kabbalah, says you don't find those stories by us. In fact, you find tzniut, anava, pashtut, modesty, humility, simplicity. ואולי גם חשש ההורים מהעינה בישה, גרמו להעלים ולסתום הדברים כמה שאפשר. And it could be that the parents were even concerned, like, maybe this is a special child. Sometimes you do see, you have a child and you say, wow, this child has a special neshama. But just like Yaakov, when Yosef comes to tell him his dreams, what does Yaakov do? It says, Va'aviv, shamar et hadavar. Yaakov believes him, and yet he doesn't say anything. He keeps it in his heart. He doesn't share his visions. And over here, Rabbi Mazuz says something very interesting, which is, you don't find the miraculous stories, the Hasidic tales, for a very simple reason. Sephardim have anava, humility. And I want to stop a minute and take a tangent about, is this humility a good thing? Has it served us well? What do you think?
No. Regarding
Rachel says no. Why?
Because humility, when you raising children, you raise them to be humble. But when they're adult and already incorporated those character traits, then there is no point in being humble or hiding your greatness when you're already great. It's okay to raise children to be humble, but not when you're already achieved and you're already adult and you're already humble. but you know your worth.
Rachel is touching on something very important. Our Ḥachamim tell us that there are two types of Ḥachamim who destroy the world. Those who really should be Morei Hora, they know halakha, but they're so afraid to ever say something, so they hold back. They sit in the back of the Beit HaKnesset, they never give the speeches, they never tell you the right and wrong halachot. They're part of the people who destroy the world. The second half is the ones who are Morei Halakha. They fill that vacuum. They come, and they always have the confidence without the knowledge. And those people, they make battlefields out of us because neither of them is good. So you're right, Rachel. There's this element of course, we all want to be humble. But at a certain point, we have to be makiret mikomenu. We have to know our place. And if HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you talents, it's no longer humility to hide it. It's your obligation to give it back to the world. Yafeh. Elchanan, you had something you wanted to add?
I think you got forgotten from other stories.
Elchanan says something very important. That humility, while it's a really good character, our Chachamim tell us, La'anavim yiten chen. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives chen. What is chen? Chen is, you ever meet people that you just like them? Everybody likes them. It's because of their humility. The humble people always have a certain, you like them. It's a likability, right? The problem, though, is when they're so humble, and I want to make a nuance, well, then maybe humility might be good in some context, and in some not. Avinom, you had something you wanted to share. Yafeh mod. Yafeh mod. Avinom brought up Binyamin, who seemingly is always a very even-keeled person, right? He's not from the ones who are extreme in one direction, like Yafeh mod. So Chacham Faor brings in his book, The Gospel According to the Jews, a quote from Rabbi Chaim Palaji, or as some like to say, Palachi, depending on the g or the ch, where you want to put the stress on. It's a chacham that is so special. We're going to talk about Be'ezrat Hashem, I think sometime in February when it's his askara. That is definitely going to be on our list. But I want to show you in his book, if I can pull it up, Birkat Moadecha Lechaim, Chelek Bet. So in his book on the Chagim, and this is a PDF, I do not have the original at home, he has a very interesting piece. Right after he talks about Chodesh Tishrei, he brings a piece on humility. Chacham Faor translates and then, in his own words, shares a fascinating thought. I want to read to you. Chacham Faor says, a fundamental trait of Sephardic tradition is national pride. We are very proud to be part of our nation. Sephardim never permitted Gentiles to trample upon Jewish national reputation or to treat the Jewish nation as some sort of international pariah needing to justify yourself to a higher court of justice. Never. We were not from the apologetics who were bending over backwards, hashtag not in my name, not in your name. That was never us. Rabbi Chaim Palaji, this is where he quotes him. One of the foremost rabbinic authorities, so we're talking about 1788 to 1896, pointed out that humility, anava, which is a much prized virtue in Jewish ethics, quote, must be reserved for internal relationships between a Jew and a Jew. A Jew should treat Gentiles neither as superiors nor as inferiors, but as equals, even when dealing with the highest aristocracy. However, and this is a quote, Rabbi Chaim Palaji says, when I find myself in the company of the Gentile aristocracy, he wrote, I feel a great aristocrat myself, because we are the children of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Rabbi Chaim Palaji explains something very important. We're all something. You see, right now I'm a teacher, but sometimes I'm in that seat and I'm a student. I'm a mother, but I'm also a child. Right? We're many different things. Rabbi Chaim Palaji teaches us that anava is the same way. It depends on the context. When it comes to people who are within our nation, where I trust you, and I know that if I humble myself and I lay myself down on the floor, you're not going to trample me. Of course, it's one of the most beautiful midot that we have. Rachmanim, Baishanim, this humility, this, I'm okay. You're one of me. It's okay for me to be humble in front of you because I know that you will never see my humility as weakness. You will never misuse my humility. You're never going to abuse me and trample me because of what you see. He said, but that's not true when it comes to dealing with the rest of the world. When it comes to dealing with the rest of the world, we're not humble. No, we don't suffer from nationalism. We're not racist. We don't live with this feeling of we're the best in the world. I know some people do, unfortunately. I think their mothers told them too much. You're the best thing that ever happened. No, not everybody's the best thing that ever happened, right? So we don't think we're superior, but we certainly don't think we're inferior. We don't come to the table with other nations feeling any less, quite to the contrary. When they come to the table, the kings and the princes and the prime minister and the president, we come as the representatives of the children of Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov. We're from aristocracy. And this is something very important that I think, unfortunately, the Sephardic world was not prepared for when it bumped into Achenu Ashkenazim. What do I mean? And I'm not going to talk about this in depth, but I think this is something that we got wrong. When the Sephardim, and I believe that Harav Peretz would say the same sentiment, when the Sephardim met the Ashkenazim, their assumption was, we're one nation. And if we're one nation and we're one people, so the first rule of Rabbi Chaim Palaji applies. We need to be humble because we're amongst brothers. We need to be able to bend, kiss, bow. The problem was the Ashkenazi community came from somewhere. I'm not going to blame it on the Jews. They came from a place that was known as imperialist. You know what an imperialist is? I see your weakness, I trample, I conquer, I divide, and I make it mine. That's how it works. And unfortunately, that was something very new to the Sephardic mind. And whereas Harav Mazuz points out something accurate, which is we didn't write stories that were so crazy, even if they existed, because they didn't make sense to record. It wasn't something important. But I'm saying, but maybe it was a mistake. Not that we didn't record those nonsensical stories, but maybe it was a mistake that the humility that the Sephardim came with ultimately led us to something that even the government of Israel recognizes today. Now I want to read to you.
You know, the Persians have an expression.
Yeah.
Step on my eyes.
Ah, yefeh.
Yep. But when the Persian tells you step on my eyes, he's giving you respect. His assumption is you're not going to actually step on his eyes.
Yefeh. That is beautiful. I feel like the Persians, for whatever reason, you see, we all have the concepts, but they have the language. Similar to Tarof. We all have that dance of, no, I pay, you pay, no, I'm not hungry, you're... But the Persians have words for it. I think it's probably because they're a very alphabetic culture. That's the truth, right? But that's exactly it.
When they showed Anava to the Ashkenazi
Yeah.
Ḥachamim, they thought they would in turn not step on them.
Yefeh.
But they did.
And they did. And they had no problem erasing them from history. So much so that in 2016, now I'm not telling you all politicians. You know what they say, you know when a politician is telling the truth? When? When his mouth is not moving. Because whenever his mouth moves, he's for sure not telling the truth. Right? That's the truth. In fact, when President Bush Sr. was running for president, part of his campaign slogan was, read my lips, there won't be a raise in taxes. And then a few months into his presidency, there was a raise in taxes. And everybody was walking around, we read your lips, they lied. What were you thinking? Of course they lied. So I'm not telling you that I believe anything these politicians said, but simply I want you to understand that this problem of anava is so real that even the government realizes what happened. So in 2016, March 1st, when Naftali Bennett was the Sar HaChinuch, he was the Minister of Education, he put together a VAD. He put together a whole new organization. And the title of this katava, of this article, is called Am Echad Ze Kol HaSipur. One nation, that's the whole story. ועדת ביטון להעצמת מורשת יהדות המזרח וספרד במערכת החינוך. They put together an organization, a committee called ועדת ביטון. The sole purpose of this was to bring back the following. So I'm going to read to you from his own words. דברי שר החינוך נפתלי בנט בהכרזה על הקמת הוועד. He's explaining why did I think it's necessary to make this committee of bringing back the history of the Sephardic Jews to the education and literature of the students in Israel. He says, היום התחלנו במהפכת מורשת יהודי המזרח במערכת החינוך. Today we're starting something revolutionary in our educational system when it comes to the heritage of the יהודי המזרח. זה אחד התפקידים הכי מרגשים, הכי מרגשים, שהיו לי מאז כנסתי לתפקיד. He said, this is something very emotional to me since I've started this job. אנחנו מחזירים היום לנוער שלנו חצי סיפור שעבד לנו בדרך. Today, we're going to bring back to our youth half the story that was lost upon the road. את סיפורי המעברות, את סיפורי הגבורה של האימהות, היציאה מן החומות, ואת אבות הציונות שבאו מאירופה, אבל גם מתוניסיה. He said, we're bringing back the stories of those who lived in tenement camps, and those who braved the cold and the wet and the sun, and walked their way to Israel, and the land...
רבנית דבורה, מאתיופיה.
אולי הוא כתב את זה, כנראה זה אחד מהביטונים. אנחנו לא יכולים לגדל דור שמכיר רק חצי ממורשתו. It cannot be that we're going to raise another generation that only knows half of its heritage. ואנחנו לא יכולים לחנך נוער ל"ואהבת לרעך כמוך", כאשר הנערים לא מכירים את רעך, שמהווה לפחות חצי מהכיתה שלהם. How could it be that we have this value of you should love your fellow as yourself when we never even took the time to educate those? There is another person outside yourself. And that person, you should know, the statistics are horrible. I know when I was teaching here locally in a school, every single year I said to the principal, 90% of my class is Sephardic, not 50%. Why is it that there's not one class that we learn also about Sephardic history? I'm teaching a class in Halakha. Why can't I also quote the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, the books of the Sephardim? It doesn't make sense. I'm not going to tell you the response, right? But
one of the major attacks on Vadat Biton
yeah,
was it's inappropriate that in the state of Israel you should talk about Sephardic things when we're supposed to be a united nation.
a united nation,
That-
right?
that
Oh, so that's, by the way-
you're dragging us to the past, and we're not there anymore.
Yafeh. So the only way to fix our problems is
Same
actually...
answer in San Diego.
Nachon. In the name of unity, we call it whitewashing of history. No, but now we're all friends, so now we could all pretend we're the same. Yeah, that's
It's
true.
like you to do Nusach Tfilah, but it will always be Nusach Tfilah.
Yafeh. So by the way, we have this similar in the early founding of the state of Israel that we had, I believe it was Harav Kabach, if I'm not mistaken, who said, now that all of Am Yisrael is coming back home together, let's all sit down at the same table. Sephardim, Ashkenazim, Teimanim, Moroccaim, Hungarians, you name it. Let's all sit by the table. And one by one, we're going to sift through our minhagim so that you're going to give up on yours, we're going to give up on ours, and together we're going to create one Am Yisrael. And unfortunately, a little bit later, he said, no, it didn't work. Because it was very clear that only one side keeps giving things up, and the other side never ever acquiesces. So maybe it's better for everybody to keep holding on to their traditions, because clearly this gibush, this bringing everything together, didn't work. Because instead of being able to say, let's take one Am and make it a united nation, it was very quickly, let's drown out one so that the dominant one can now take over. So you find over here, he says, how could it be? It can't be that we're sitting in the land of Israel, where at least half the class is from the Yotzrei Sefarad, and the curriculum covers nothing about their history. It says, אנחנו מזמינים את אזרחי ישראל לקחת חלק בוועדת ביטון, לשלוח אלינו סיפורים והצעות, ולהיות חלק מקביעת התוכניות של הדור הבא שלנו. He said, I'm asking you, please, nationwide, send us information. You have stories about your grandparents, you have stories about the communities you come from. Give us input in creating the curriculum so we can make a more balanced curriculum. אני מודה, he says, אני מודה לחתן פרס ישראל, המשורר ארז ביטון, שנרתם למשימה ומיד כאשר קראנו לו, אמר הנני. Who said הנני? אברהם אבינו. יפה מאוד. Who else? Moshe Rabbeinu also. I think Eliyahu Hanavi. I feel like it. I don't know if I'm right. Yeah? הנני, I am ready for this job. פתחנו את שנת הלימודים הקודמת בסימן צמצום הכיתות בישראל, ואת שנת הלימודים הבא נפתח בסימן הרחבת המורשת הישראלית בכיתות אלה קדימה לעבודה. It says, yalla, even though this year maybe we didn't fully expand and it changed the curriculum, moving forward, we're going to make these changes. Now, this was in 2019. He gave a good speech. Unfortunately, I just watched a video, not even last week. It came up, B'siyata Dishmaya, somebody who is talking directly to Naftali Bennett. He says, Naftali, you had a wonderful proposal. I waited 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Nothing happened. Aside for a few stories here and there and a few changes here and there, unfortunately, the mission that you set out to bring back, l'chzor atara liyashna, to bring back the glory of half of Am Yisrael's story, hasn't yet happened. He says, so I'm still waiting. I'm still hopeful. Anything that has to do with governments takes a lot of time. That's the truth. Anything good takes time. But I think Rabbi Mazuz touched on something true, which is the teva of the Sephardi was not to tell the stories because they didn't feel that they were significant. Not that the characters weren't significant, but what they felt was significant was the books, the Torah. What do you have to hear about the Otot Moftim? Who cares? What does it have to do with the Torah, the Halacha, the Mesorah? And yet I am adding that maybe that was a mistake. Because though we don't need the magical stories, unfortunately, without telling the stories at all, we have an entire history that got wiped out. There's an entire side of the story that was never told. And when you try to retell stories, sometimes it doesn't always work so well. You know, sometimes when later on you try to, from recollection, to make things up, to patch things together, to put vadot, it's not natural anymore. It suddenly becomes projects, and nobody wants to be another project. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel nice. But I think that's something accurate to think about. So that's one reason. Rabbi Mazuz shares with us something else. He says, Siba shniya, my second reason that I believe this genre doesn't exist. Now I want to add a little footnote. If you think I'm making this up, if you think Rabbi Mazuz is telling you something that's not accurate, I want you to know I was looking at the Anaf Etz Avot by Chacham Ovadia Yosef. Now, you could tell me maybe I don't know stories about Sephardic Jews. I believe you. You cannot tell me that about Chacham Ovadia Yosef. Okay, if there was somebody who knew everything about Sephardim, and yet when he's bringing stories in his entire Pirkei Avot, if you look at the index, for example, all his stories are from the Vilna Gaon, the Dubna Magid, the Balatanya. For those of you unfamiliar, the references, by and large, are stories from either Hasidim or Ashkenazi leaders, not Sephardim. Again, because that genre is so scarce. Yeah, so it's not that he omitted them purposely. It's simply we don't have that genre. And that's why this whole book, which is a tremendous amount of storytelling, Chacham Ovadia Yosef doesn't tell stories about the rabbis in Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and Iraq. Here and there, yeah. But by and large, not at all. Now, Chacham Mazuz tells us another reason. He says, Siba Shniya, I'm at the bottom of my page. Let me tell you what's going to be in your Siba Shniya. Is going to be on the bottom of page, really on the top of page Yud, 10. סיבה שנייה, אצל חכמי הספרדים עד הזמן האחרון היה עיסוק זה בסיפורי צדיקים ובתולדות חכמי ישראל כיבוד זמן חס ושלום. He said up until very recently, this idea of storytelling, of telling these masterful imagination stories, was considered a waste of time. Chas v'shalom. He says, שמעתי מפי מר אבא זצ"ל, I heard this from my father, שחכמי תוניס הקדמונים לא היו מחזיקים בבית ספר, בבית, ספר אבו דרהם, מחשש לביטול תורה. You have to understand the sentence. He says, my father told me that in Tunis, there were some who didn't even have the book of the Abu Draham. The Sefer Abu Draham is the book that you go to understand our Siddur. We're talking about a Sefer. And yet the Chachamim weren't sure, maybe it's not from the genre of scholarly work, maybe it's not even something we should learn. So you could imagine if that's the way they felt about the Sefer Abu Draham, which everybody studies. If you want to learn anything about Sidurim and Minhagim, customs, halachot, that's the book you're going to go to. If that's how they felt about a book, you could imagine what they felt about stories. Yeah. He says, Michshash, Be'atra Dileil Yarka, Chidushei Agada U'Biyorei Tefillah, right? His book, the Abu Draham, is really, it's important. Kach amru. He said, we're not sure. It's not about halacha necessarily. It's not about Mishnah, Gemara, Chas v'Shalom. Don't get me wrong that the book isn't significant. Simply, the attitude was, maybe it's from the readings that pachot. Gam, he said, you find this, Gam behespedim al Rabbanim chachmei Tunis. You find, אישיותו של הרב בערי פלפולים וחידוש ולעולם לא תוכל להציל מפי הדרשון מילה על גדלותו ומעשיו של הרב. He said, you found, even in the time that they gave Hespedim, when they came to give eulogies about the rabbi, the eulogies were never filled with his stories of miracles. It was about how much Torah he knew, how much HaShamayim he had, what kind of work he did for the community, how he cared about the nation, but never was it storytelling about all the grandiose miracles. V'inei dugma badorenu. He said, I want to give you an example. הגאון המפורסם, רבי עזרא עטיה זצ"ל. ראש ישיבת, who is חכם עזרא עטיה אלחנן?
Chacham Ezra at
ישיבת
the
פורת?
Yosef.
Very good. Really?
He's the teacher of Chacham.
Oh,
That cup that Avinam talking about.
yeah.
The one Avinam fresh.
Nachon. If you look at, okay, if you ever look at, there are pictures of Chacham Ezra Atiya's class. It's like a dream team class. We're talking about Chacham Ovadia Yosef. Chacham, who's Aviyam Shel Yisrael? Who am I thinking of? Chacham Mordechai Eliyahu. We're talking about Harav Shlush. All the giants that you know from the poskim, from the leaders of Am Yisrael, at least from the Sephardic world, that was in his class. Okay, that was the Porat Yosef class taught by Chacham Ezra Atiyah. And yet, if you find, זה שהעיד עליו החזון איש, שסברתו כסברת ראשונים. The Chazon Ish, who was in Bnei Brak, said, you want to know somebody who thinks like a Rishon, like from the generations before? Go see Chacham Ezra Atiyah. זה שהעמיד גדולי עולם המעניקים חמה בקומתם. The students, every single one that graduated from his class, became not a leader, a super leader of Am Yisrael. לא זכה לספר תולדות משלו מפי תלמידיו הרבים. You find no autobiography about him. Not from his students. Why? כולם עסוקים בלימודם, ואין להם פנאי לספר מעשיו לדורות. He was a successful teacher. You know why he was successful? Because he taught his students how to learn. So what did they keep themselves busy with? Learning. They didn't have extra time to be writing fairy tales, because they were busy learning. רק כעבור 20 שנה מפטירתו, התעוררה סופרת אחת, ולקטה פנינים מפי תלמידיו ומכיריו, ויצא ספר המורה. It's only 20 years after he died. There was some nice lady who, she was an author, and she decided to collect some writings and books, and she published a book called The Teacher. But his students never thought to publish something like that. Why? Because this genre wasn't important. What was important was you became a scholar. And the ultimate success of the teacher was not that after he died there were autobiographies and people writing stories about him, but the fact that his students went on to become the legal decisors of Am Yisrael. Vasaper kan, he says, let me tell you another story. מה ששמעתי מהרב הגאון רבי שלמה בן שמעון, שליטה, מעשה שנוכח בו. I want to tell you a story that happened, that was told to me. A story was told to me, and the character that told me the story is the one that the story happened to. יפה מאוד. He says, פעם הגיע להם לישיבת פורת יוסף. He says, once, פעם הגיע להם לישיבת פורת יוסף הגאון רבי משה אביגדור עמיאל ז"ל. רבה של תל אביב. I just found his book. I believe he was a rabbi in Europe before. He came to the Yeshivat Porat Yosef, this Rabbi Moshe Avigdor, and he started to give a speech. ונתן שיעור נפלא בסוגיה אחת במשך שעה וחצי. An hour and a half, he's giving a speech. It's unbelievable. It's incredible. The sources, his... ורב עזרא עטיה זצ"ל הקשיב, קשב רב. ראש ישיבה, חכם עזרא עטיה, he's listening. לאחר השיעור, פנה הגאון לראש ישיבה ואמר לו, מה דעת כבודו על הפלפול שלי? This Rabbi Moshe Avigdor turns to Chacham Ezra and he says, what do you think? What do you think about the genius that I brought to the table? He was originally from Europe, though, and then he moved. Yeah? Is he not the one who wrote the book, The Chaos of... Yeah. Rabbi Amiel, nachon. So Chacham Ezra answers him. He wasn't going to say anything, but you asked. He says, Hakol tov yafeh. שפתיים נשק. אבל יש דיבור רש"י אחד במסכת שבועות הסותר את כל פלפולו. He says everything was beautiful and nice, but I just want you to know that there's a Rashi in this Masechet Shavuot that really destroys the whole tower that you just built. So Rabbi Moshe answers, לא ייתכן. ענה הגאון רבי משה אביגדור עמיאל. He says, no, it can't be. ועמד והרצה כל הסוגיה במסכת שבועות בעל פה. And he went and he recited the whole entire מסכת שבועות. You have to understand the genius of Rabbi Moshe. Because if I asked you, can you recite the whole, I don't know, I could barely recite the first verses of the Chumash. You think, no, he recited the whole מסכת שבועות, and he said, it's not there what you're saying. אמר לו ראש הישיבה, הכל טוב ויפה, אבל כבודו שכח מילה אחת. בפירוש רש"י שם. He says, everything's nice, everything's good, everything you said is wonderful, but you left out one word, and that one word is the most significant word. ואכן הביאו מסכת שבועות, ויש שם מילה אחת שסתרה את כל הפיפול. So they went and they grabbed off the bookshelf one of the books, and they opened up to Masechet Shavuot, and Chacham Ezra was right. There was one little word that this Chacham was missing that destroyed the whole tower that he built. שאלתי, so Chacham Mazuz says, שאלתי את הרב הגאון, רבי שלמה בן שמעון, האם כבודו זוכר במה העניין? Do you remember what was the topic about? אמר, שכחתי הכל, I forgot everything. אמרתי בליבי, and I said in my heart, says הרב מזוז, חבל. לו הייתי שם, הייתי רושם את הדברים למזכרת עולם. Had I been there, I would have written everything down, so I would remember everything.
Even the genius of the answer, they forgot to write down.
And what happens? You find over here, exactly, that here's such a brilliant story, and yet the story was so insignificant that even the storyteller says, I don't actually remember. I remember the story. The little details, no, because in the world that I came from, the storytelling, the glorification, the wonders, it wasn't so relevant. The fact that Chacham came, he gave a shiur, we learned Torah, that mattered. That was important. And I think that you find something very important Chacham Mazuz is sharing with us. Number one, we don't know the stories because of Anava. But number two, it's not just Anava. It's where we chose to focus. And the Sephardic Chachamim specifically said, the magic we don't care about. The kishuv, it doesn't matter. Bring me somebody who's a scholar. Bring me somebody who knows how to write books. Somebody who knows how to learn Torah. Somebody who has yirat shamayim. Somebody who is humble. That's a big deal. Everything else doesn't matter. Because today, unfortunately, and I want to end off maybe with a piece from Chacham Faor, where he talks about, I did it when you were not here. He says there are two different types of speakers. One, unfortunately, will always be attracted to this personality. You see, in a world where you're alphabetic, you know Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Bereshit, Bara Elohim, Me'ematai Korim et Kriyat Shema, then what you're attracted to is less stories and much more authentic Torah, the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because you have the ability to take those concepts and internalize them to make you a better person. But when you don't have language, then the only thing you're really left to is theatrics, the storytelling, the feeling, the emotion, because you can't appeal to my intellect, because I don't have it. I don't have that capacity. What you could engage with is my feelings, my emotions, pull on my heartstrings. And you're going to find, Chacham Power says, therefore, he says the analphabetic crowds will invariably choose the magic of heroes and poets over the wisdom of scribes and sages. A community that doesn't know how to read, and I don't mean just know how to read, but doesn't know how to read and internalize and to break down and put it into context, they have nothing to do with information. And therefore, they will always find magic of heroes and poets so much better. It's why when somebody comes here and says, everybody close your eyes, and we're going to dream together, and we're going to sing together, we're going to light candles, I feel so nice, it feels so good. Because the only thing that it's stirring in me is my heart. You didn't engage my head, but I don't have a head to engage with. And therefore, I like that kind of magic. It makes me feel good. Those kind of stories, wow. Look at how much emunah it gives me. Maybe, maybe not. He continues a little bit further on and he says, it is not a mistake that people are anti-book and anti-humanism. They're the products of dismal spirits, preferring the rule of tyrants and demagogues to the 7 blessings of our rabbis. is that you find very quickly that the people who choose not to engage in the book, maybe initially there are poets and magicians and heroes, but very quickly the heroes take off their capes and they become tyrants because they realize that this crowd is very easy to control. Because this crowd can be swayed by feelings, by fear, by love, by hurt, by sadness, by joy, because they're not engaging with their minds. And I think that that's something very important because we're going to move next week into, okay, so then what is the prototype Chacham that we do want to learn from? Because now we definitely understand that the fantastical, magical stories, yeah, maybe they feel good in here and there. You can read them, but we certainly don't want to overdose on them. We certainly don't want to swallow them all alive. We certainly don't want them to replace our alphabetic understanding and our history with nonsense of gobbledygook. Because even if it tastes good, it's really poisonous. And that's what we're going to talk about next time, which is, okay, so if we understand why this genre doesn't necessarily exist, what is the kind of chacham that you and I want to study? What is it that we're looking out for? In what kind of story is there something that you and I can engage with our minds so that once we've processed it, it trickles down to our heart, and yes, it gives us more yirat shamayim. Because our goal is reshit chokhmah, yirat Adonai. We're not trying to intellectualize things so much to the point that your heart is no longer there. Simply, we want to engage it in that order. We want to engage our minds and then our hearts so that the chachamim that we choose to focus on, the chachamim that we bring to light, are the ones that bring the Torah, the glory, the truth that we as a nation so sorely lack. And Be'ezrat Hashem, when we know our history and we know our truth, we will then be able to reclaim our place in the world's history. And if the world needs us, we're coming up to Chanukah. It couldn't be a darker time for the world. We need to bring back light. And like our Chachamim tell us, a little light, shraga v'tiara mahayani. If you light a candle during the day, what does it do? It doesn't bring any, it's useless. But if you're in the dark and you put on even a tiny light, it lights up the whole world. And I believe that's the goal of this course. That Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to learn Torah through the lens of our Chachamim, specific Chachamim, who will let us bring back the light. Or chadash al Tzion ta'ir, v'niskeh kulanu yachad b'mhera b'mora. We're going to bring back a new light to Tzion, and it's going to spread Be'ezrat Hashem to the whole world. Until then, I want to wish you a beautiful night. Thank you for coming out to learn.
Were you going to share
Yes.
the story once about the Shagat Aryeh and the Baal Seder Hador? Were you or you're not planning to?
Not tonight.
I'll share a different night.
Oh, do you want to share it? Yeah, please.
However, there are two, the Rabbanit Shiur, you might end off here like, okay, what's the point of learning them stories in the first place? So number one, I think I know a little bit about what the Rabbanit's material is prepared in the future. And more than she's going to be telling you stories, she plans to teach you Torah from different Chachamim in different places. But, there's a famous story about two Ashkenazi Chachamim. They're very famous. One wrote a book called the Shagat Aryeh, the Roar of the Lion. They say that he looked like a lion, like he was orange hair, big beard, and when he screamed, like he looked like a lion was screaming at you. People were scared of him. He was a brilliant Chacham. A lot of pilpulim, very, very deep, casuistic explanations of the Talmud. And almost you read his books, unless you're very smart, you don't understand what he's writing at all. And the other rabbi was a famous rabbi. He wrote a book called the Seder Hadorot. It's like a book of Jewish history, stories about this rabbi, about that rabbi, throughout the generations, a lot of stories. They say they once met each other. And the Baal Shagat Aryeh was a little bit like, look at this storytelling rabbi, it's a cute guy. And he was speaking to him, a little bit like he was a very simple rabbi. And asked him, he was speaking to him like that. And Baal said, listen, why do you think I'm not important? Why do you talk to me like that? So let me ask you a question. It says that one day the Torah is going to be forgotten from the Jewish people. Rabbi Meir says, "Atid Torah shetishlakach misrael." It will happen that the Torah will be forgotten from the Jewish people. He says, "What are you going to do when the Torah gets forgotten from the Jewish people?" So Baal said, "What are you going to do when the Torah gets forgotten from the Jewish people?" He said, "By me, when the Jewish people forget the Torah, when they read my book, The Roaring of the Lion, they're going to be so shocked into life that they're going to remember all the Torah they forgot." He said, "But what are you going to do with your book of stories?" Then my book of stories of Chachamim, it's going to make sure that nobody forgets the Torah in the first place. And I think that's the difference here. One has an attitude, what are you going to do when they forget the Torah? I'll remind them. The other one says, no, if I teach the Jewish people about our Ḥachamim, they never will forget the Torah in the first place. So really, as much as the Rabbanit was telling you that our Ḥachamim, they didn't care so much to share the stories, and they more were focused on the Torah, but I do think that the telling of these stories is exactly what is going to protect the Torah that they give us. So, this mitzvot.